Thank you for being here tonight. This morning I preached a sermon about peace in the church. We looked at Philippians chapter 2, where Paul describes the blessings that we have in Christ that are to be used for us to find peace, for us to be like-minded. He even goes so far as to qualify what he means by being like-minded. And we spent some time talking about that this morning. Tonight's lesson serves as a bookend to that subject. Tonight we're going to talk about division in the wilderness. I'd like to use some of the history of Israel this evening as we consider our work as a local church and draw on a very sad and tragic era in Israel's history and use that as a way to draw some important lessons about our work here at Fry Road. So if you have the handout, you'll see how my lesson tonight is going to be presented. It's in two parts, essentially. So we'll take a look at Israel becoming dissatisfied. And most of what we're going to talk about comes from Numbers, the 12th chapter through chapter 16. I'm not going to read those chapters to you tonight, but I'm going to try to summarize them. It's a lengthy reading, of course, and a history that this audience is very likely well familiar with. But Israel grows very dissatisfied. They grow dissatisfied with one another. They grow dissatisfied with the leadership. They grow dissatisfied with God, and it is costly in a number of ways. But as we pick up this part of Israel's history, this is sort of in the middle of the Exodus story. Of course, God took action in honoring the covenant that He made with Abraham and liberated Israel from slavery in Egypt. And you'll recall as they were making their journey in the early days that they came upon the Red Sea. And as they got to the Red Sea, Pharaoh had sent the military to destroy the Israelites. And of course, that put them in a very difficult position. And God performed a miracle, and the Red Sea was parted, and they crossed over on dry land, whereas the Egyptians went to their watery graves. A tremendous victory that they experienced by the good grace of their God. It must have been overwhelming to have experienced that victory. So much so it was that Moses and Miriam composed a song to commemorate that victory that would be noted and remembered for generations among God's people. Well, victories, can be short-lived, and their victory was short-lived. 3 days later, 3 days after this great deliverance, we find Israel in the wilderness and they're thirsty. That's understandable. In the wilderness, a dry place, they're thirsty. And they begin to complain about being thirsty. And so God responds to them, and God provides them water. And if you go over in Exodus chapter 15, I know I said Numbers 12 to 16, but this is recounted in Exodus 15. At that point, God gives them water and issues a warning to them. It doesn't seem that God is just angry with them and He's going to punish them. He gives them water to drink and then warns them about their dissatisfaction, about their complaining. Sort of like parents with their children, don't let this happen again, kind of a thing. And that should have taken care of it. Of course, it does not. It does not. This complaining is a recurring problem with Israel. And there are moments in time where they're very dissatisfied with God. They are wanting to go back to Israel. They're critical of Moses in their situation. So complaining becomes a very dominant issue in this period of their history. But as they're dealing with the difficulties and challenges of being in the wilderness, they become very critical of the leadership The discord is directed toward the leadership. It's directed toward Moses. And if you look into Numbers chapter 11 and into chapter 12, it's kind of interesting how things develop. In Numbers chapter 11, God has Moses appoint 70 men, 70 elders who are going to share in the burden of leading the people. They're going to share in the work of leadership. And God's Spirit is given to these 70 men. And that they're given instructions about how they were to go about their work. It appears that they were supposed to do this work collectively, as a group, together, the 70 of them. But then two of them sort of go off on their own. And this comes to the attention of Moses that these two men, whose names are even mentioned, are prophesying on their own. And not much else is said about that, but they're prophesying on their own apart from the other 68 elders. And then you get into the 12th chapter, and the 12th chapter there's discord among the leadership of the nation of Israel. And it would appear to be that there is a question of, well, who's in charge? There's a question among the people about who's in charge. A question even among the leadership. Miriam and Aaron were helping Moses in the leadership. And Miriam and Aaron become dissatisfied. And it seems to be that they're not willing to allow Moses to continue as he was. And so they rebel against Moses. Well, as you may remember, God intervenes. God intervenes when they rebel against Moses. And it would appear that Miriam was the instigator. And the reason why I think that is because God punished her by striking her with leprosy. Aaron's not stricken with leprosy, but Miriam is, for her rebellion. She's spared, though. She's spared, but now she has to, because she was stricken with leprosy, she has to go outside the camp. And that phrase hopefully would mean something to you, as was part of their new law. If you had leprosy, you could not dwell among the people. And so as she is taken outside the camp, then what may have been an internal problem between Miriam, Aaron, and Moses would become known among the people. From the standpoint of, well, why is Miriam outside the camp? What's gone on there? You can imagine the chatter among the Israelites. Well, that is the context in which they're brought to Canaan. They're brought to the promised land, their inheritance, and they're going to take the land. And so spies, you remember, are selected. 12 spies, one from each tribe, were sent into the land of Canaan to find out about the land, sort of a reconnaissance mission. They're going to have to conquer the land. They do this just as there's all kinds of division and discord and murmuring going on among the people and even within the leadership of the people. Well, the spies, they return, and you remember that, 10 of them have a report that, yes, the land is good. It's everything that we had dreamt of, but we'll never be able to take it. The people were too big. They're fearful. And, as you know, bad news has a way of traveling rather quickly. And so this bad report of the 12 or of the 10 spies, of course, Joshua and Caleb, the two, they said, yes, there's challenges, but God's with us. Look how far God has brought us along to this point. We can take the land by the help and leadership of God. Fear takes over, though. Fear takes over. And it's not just that, they're cowering in fear and they don't want to take the land, but there's rebellion. There's rebellion. We want to go back to Egypt. They want to overthrow the leadership of Israel. Go back to Egypt. That's what every time they were met with an obstacle, we want to go back to Egypt. You can't go back to Egypt. You can't go back to Egypt. Egypt is death. There's no hope in Egypt. You were slaves in Egypt. You were oppressed in Egypt. You can't go back there. There's only one way. You have to go forward. Always forward. But fear took over. Fear took over. And they were punished. They were punished because of it. 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, an entire generation of Israelites would die because of their rebellion. Well, just as that punishment was pronounced by God because of the fear and distrust and complaining that was going on among the people, there was one man who was not willing to take that sitting down. Korah rose up in rebellion. Korah seems to be someone who looked at this dire situation as an opportunity. Korah was very careful in planning and plotting his rebellion. He went and he found 250 men who were influential among the people. They were going to present a united front against Moses and the leadership that God had given the people. And not only do they have this united front, but they persuade others to go along with them. And as they begin this rebellion, as they begin to cause division among the people, God intervenes. And just as Korah caused division in Israel, God caused division in the earth, and it opened up and swallowed up Korah and his rebels. But it was more than just Korah and those 250 supporters of his. It was also the other Israelites that he had persuaded to go along with him. By the end of Korah's rebellion, there's nearly 15,000 Israelites who are killed as a punishment for their division in the wilderness. And afterwards, they begin their 40 years of wandering. This is a terrible, terrible period of history. It's just horrible when you think about what went on, what could have been avoided. What could have been avoided? This was not the intention of God. God didn't want this. But this happened as a result of people rebelling. So what can we learn from it? There's lessons that have got to be learned from it. Many, many years after all of this happened, this history that I have just recounted to you tonight was recounted in a letter to Christians. It was recounted in a letter to a church, reminding them about what comes when there is a lack of faith, when there is complaining, when there is rebellion. In Hebrews chapter 3, in verses 7 to 12, the writer says this: "Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness, where your fathers put me to the test and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore, I was provoked with that generation and said, they always go astray in their heart. They've not known my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God." That's a very serious admonition that the writer gives. And if you remember anything at all about the recipients of this letter, these were a group of Christians who had gotten off to a very good start. They had gotten off to a very good start. But for a variety of reasons, they had begun to become unfaithful. And their relationships were just breaking apart. Some of them just giving up the faith altogether. And the writer is trying to encourage them not to give up. Not to give up on God, not to give up on one another, but to strengthen their faith, to learn the lessons of the faithless of a bygone era. So what can we learn about Israel's division in the wilderness and some things that this text brings out? Is first of all, we have to trust God. We have to trust God. And maybe you think, well, that's really not a point worth making. Because we all know we've got to trust God. What does it mean to trust God? That means something, doesn't it? It's not just some general kind of abstraction that's out here that, we trust God and we just sort of go about our lives. Trusting God, it means something very specific. Trusting God has to do with trusting in His Word, how He's expressed Himself to us. It has to do with trusting in His Son. It has to do with trusting in His Spirit, who leads us, just as the Spirit of God led Israel for those 40 years. It has to do with trusting in the institutions that God has established for us as Christians and as a church. Again, trusting in God is not some abstraction. It's something that has very specific meaning to our relationships, to our day-to-day lives, to how we go about our work as a local church. It has to do with trusting in His method of how to use power and influence. These things are not used for selfish purposes, but rather in the interest of self-giving love, going back to things that Jesus had spoken in His lifetime in Mark chapter 10. So we've got to trust God. Israel's problem is they didn't. They didn't trust God. They didn't trust His Word. They didn't trust the leadership that God gave them. And as a result, everything just fell apart. They made plans. Korah was a calculating man. He was a smart, influential man. He wasn't a dummy. He knew exactly what he was doing. And it was all for nothing. His plan didn't lead to life. It led to death. That should serve as a lesson to what happens when we trust our own judgment, when we trust our own wisdom, when we put what God has given, when we put it aside and go our own way. Nothing good ever comes of it. Nothing good ever has. We've got to learn the lessons of Israel's history, as is stated here in Hebrews chapter 3. We've got to trust God. Secondly, if we want to put an even finer point on it, we have to support the eldership. We have to support the eldership. You can make the connection, can't you, between the leadership that Israel had and to the leadership that God has given the church? Right? We're not just some random group of Christians who come together once in a while and just make it up as we go along. That's not the way God intended His church to function. God's not the author of confusion, as was said by Paul. He's a God of order. He's a God of peace. He's a God of harmony and unity. This trip was long and difficult. It had a variety of challenges that they would have to address. So to do that, God gave them leadership. What we learn from here is that nothing leads to unity. Rebellion doesn't lead to unity. God rebuked and punished Miriam for her actions. It's no small thing when we rise up in rebellion against the leadership that God has given. It's no small thing to rise up in rebellion against an eldership, ours or wherever you're a member. It's not a small thing. God does not look kindly upon that. Elders have a very difficult task. Leadership is very difficult. Moses was often overwhelmed by what he had to do. You remember as they began to make their journey, he went to his father-in-law, and Jethro looks at him and he says, you can't do this on your own. You need help. There was a physical and emotional toll that it was taking on Moses. It was noticeable when his father-in-law saw him. And so too is the toll that it takes on men and their wives who serve as elders. I have said many times, I don't know why a man would want to be an elder. I have worked with elders. Since I was a teenager. So I say I don't know why a man would want to be an elder, because an elder is a very difficult task. It's a thankless task in too many situations. They devote their time, they devote their energy, they're motivated by love for the souls that have been entrusted to their care. They're trying to keep the flock together. They're trying to keep the flock growing spiritually, providing for its needs. That certainly is true of the elders that we have here. That has been my observation in the time that I've been with this group. And they're concerned about how to take care of the group. I told you this morning in Philippians chapter 2 that being a servant is about putting the interests of the group before your own. If you want to serve as an elder, it's a good thing to aspire to. But it's about putting the interests of the group ahead of your own. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verses 12 to 17, Paul writes a series of instructions to the church there. And the context of the church at Thessalonica is interesting in that when Paul writes the letter to them, they're a newly established church and they're being persecuted. Could you imagine the situation that church was in? Paul didn't want to leave, but he had to leave for the sake of his life. They took him out of town. But they were there, they're being persecuted. How could that church function? How was that church going to survive a crisis? At the close of this letter, he says, "We ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves. We urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient to them all. See that no one repays anyone evil for evil, but always seeks to do good to one another and to everyone. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you." Now, if you read that in the context that this church was going through a crisis, how are they going to get through it? By relying on their elders, by relying upon the leadership that God had given that group. So we must do the same. We've been through a crisis, to be sure, in the last 3 years. Some very difficult circumstances. Unforeseen doesn't even begin to describe it, does it? Now, what do? Well, we could all go our own way. We can all go our own way. Nothing good will come of it. Or we can come together and we can rely and support our eldership. I mean, as a gospel preacher, I view myself as I'm in a support role. When elders come to me and they ask me to do something, I find a way to make that happen, to be as accommodating as I possibly can. And I hope that we all would have that kind of an attitude. That's what service is about. The elders here, they have a vision, they have a perspective that is based upon who they are as Christians, as experienced in life and faith. And when they come to me and say, "David, we'd like you to teach on this," my answer is always, okay. Because their perspective is valued. I will do whatever I can do to be accommodating to it. And if we could do that, if we could all grow in that, then we could avoid the kinds of problems that, well, our forefathers endured. Support the eldership. And then resolve conflict peaceably. I said to you this morning that as long as human beings are involved, there's going to be conflicts. There's going to be issues. There's going to be differences in perspectives. Maybe the elders decide to do something, you think, I wouldn't do it that way. Now, if that happens, you can do one of two things. You can criticize, or you can be accommodating. I mean, when it comes to how the local church is supposed to function and what it's supposed to do in its work, it takes judgment. Well, whose judgment? Well, in the New Testament, it's the judgment of the eldership in determining how we go about our work. Which is why, in my work, if I have a difference of opinion or I think, well, I wouldn't go about it that way, it's my responsibility to defer to them. Here at Fry Road or wherever else I would be, because that's how God has delegated authority. Preachers don't run the church. Preachers who, think they run the church, to use an expression of my grandpa, they're in for a rude awakening. You can be accommodating and supportive, or you can be critical. And being critical and undermining, it doesn't do any good. It doesn't do any good. So what's the solution? What's the solution when we have those conflicts, when there is a difference of perspective? Those things can be discussed. Those things can be worked out. Listen very carefully to me. The solution is not for us to part ways. The solution is not for us to part ways. I left out 3 important details in the history that we recounted. On 3 occasions, when there was discord and rebellion and complaining, God punished. And on each of those occasions, Moses begged for the salvation of those people. When Aaron and Miriam undermined him, tried to cast him aside, and God intervened and struck Miriam with leprosy, Moses was not standing there triumphantly. He begged God to heal her. When God decided He was going to punish the generation that had complained and that they were going to wander and die in the wilderness, God was ready to destroy the entire nation. He says, I'll make a nation out of you, Moses. And Moses begged and pleaded to save those people. And then it happened again in the aftermath of Korah. It's no wonder in Numbers chapter 12 that Moses was described as the meekest man in all the earth. Moses displayed the kind of character, the kind of heart that God's looking for. Matter of fact, we can take it a step further. Moses was behaving like the Messiah. And that's biblical. Sometimes we look at that just in an academic sort of way. That is, intervening symbolizes the intervening that the Messiah would do. But it was much more than that, wasn't it? When Moses is described as meek, it's describing his heart, describing his character. Character from which we all can learn a great deal. So, we don't want to develop evil hearts of unbelief. What's an evil heart of unbelief? It's a bad attitude. It's a bad attitude. What we mentioned this morning. Bad attitudes divide. You see it all over. Numbers 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. So let's do our part. let's do our part to seek peace, to maintain it, to work together, for the sake of one another's salvation, for the sake of having influence in our community. I appreciate your attention tonight. I hope the lesson will help you, will help us all as we work together here at Fry Road. As we bring the lesson to a close, if there's anyone here tonight who needs to make their life right with God, you have an opportunity to do so. If there's sin in your life, then God is waiting with outreached arms to forgive you, to renew you. If you need to be saved tonight, please come forward and make your request known to us. Right now, as together we stand and sing.